Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The Cannibal City. Scary story, published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scray Fiction. Chapter 1. The Unending Dusk. The dying sun cast the sky in a bruised purple, an unwelcome visitor that barely pierced the oppressive gloom cloaking Hollow Creek. John Hawkins squinted through the dusty haze, his weathered face etched with a weariness that went beyond sleep deprivation. 10 years in the Marines hadn't prepared him for this scavenging for scraps in a city perpetually trapped in the twilight hour. Think this place ever saw a sunrise, Hawk? The voice belonged to Ethan, a lanky teenager whose once bright eyes now held the haunted glint of someone who'd seen too much. John grunted, the familiar ache in his knee protesting the climb up the rusted fire escape. Used to, John rasped, his voice rough from years of desert dust and battlefield hollers. Hollow Creek was a damn fine town. All-American baseball team, 4th of July fireworks that could light up the whole damn state. A bitter chuckle escaped John's lips. The pristine image of Hollow Creek he conjured was a stark contrast to the decaying concrete jungle that now stretched before them. Buildings, once vibrant with life, stood like crooked teeth, their windows dark and hollow. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the rustle of wind through skeletal trees and the ever-present hum of fluorescent street lamps that cast an eerie green glow on everything. "What about your family, Hawk?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. John shoved the question aside. Talking about the past was a luxury he couldn't afford, not in this twilight wasteland. He pointed towards a boarded-up storefront, grocery store. Might have some canned goods left untouched. They picked their way through the debris-strewn street, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of broken glass under their boots. John scanned rooftops and alleys, his senses on high alert. It was the safe time, the few precious hours before dusk, when the city belonged to the living, not the others. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood, a chilling reminder that their safety was a fragile thing. John's grip tightened around the makeshift crowbar he'd fashioned from a metal pipe. They reached the grocery store, the plywood door splintered and hanging precariously. John shoved it open, the stench of rotting food assaulting their noses. Cobwebs draped dusty shelves, like macabre Halloween decorations. Ethan coughed, his hand flying to his mouth. John winced. It was always a gamble, venturing into these abandoned structures. But they were running low on supplies, and the meager rations Reverend Crow doled out from their hidden haven wouldn't last much longer. John used a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing rows of empty shelves. Disappointment gnawed at him. Just as he was about to turn back, a glint of metal caught his eye. Canned beans, tucked away in a forgotten corner. Relief washed over him, a fleeting moment of warmth in the ever-present chill. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed through the store, sending shivers down John's spine. Ethan stumbled back, dropping his own scavenged bag. John whirled around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Darkness shifted in the back of the store, a low, rasping sound emanating from it. John felt a primal surge of fear, a fear honed on battlefields and reinforced by the horrors of this twilight existence. He knew what lurked in the shadows. It wasn't the first time they'd encountered one mutated. The creature stepped out of the darkness, a grotesque parody of a human being. Its flesh hung in loose flaps, revealing glistening bone beneath. Blood dripped from its jagged teeth, and its eyes burned with an unnatural hunger. John raised his crowbar, adrenaline flooding his system. This wasn't war. There were no rules here. just survival. He lunged forward, the crowbar a blur in the dim light. The creature roared, a sound that ripped through the silence like a banshee's wail. It dodged John's first swing, lashing out with a claw that ripped through John's sleeve. Pain flared, but John ignored it, adrenaline overriding everything else. The fight was brutal, a desperate dance between predator and prey. The creature's inhuman strength matched John's honed military skills blow for blow. Ethan, frozen in fear, finally reacted. He grabbed a stray can of beans and hurled it at the creature, the projectile connecting with a dull thud on its head. The momentary distraction was all John needed. He brought the crowbar down with a sickening crunch, shattering the creature's skull. It crumpled to the floor, its lifeless eyes reflecting the distorted image of the dying sun struggling to pierce the twilight. John sank to his knees, panting, sweat beading on his forehead. The fight had drained him, leaving an unsettling emptiness in its. Chapter 2. The hungry dark descends. John's breath rasped in his throat, a harsh counterpoint to the silence that had abruptly descended upon the grocery store. Ethan, pale and trembling, huddled in a corner, clutching a can of beans like a talisman against the horrors they'd just witnessed. John stared at the lifeless creature, a wave of nausea washing over him. It was a grim reminder of the brutal reality they faced every night. Gathering his strength, John limped over to Ethan, his hand instinctively reaching for the crowbar. It felt reassuringly heavy in his grip. "You all right, kid?" His voice sounded rougher than usual. Ethan nodded mutely, his eyes never leaving the fallen creature. John forced a smile, a gesture that felt hollow. "We got to get back. Sun's setting soon." They navigated their way back to their haven, a fortified apartment building hidden amongst a maze of decaying structures. Reverend Crow, a tall man with a shock of white hair and a voice that boomed with practiced piety, greeted them at the entrance. His face etched with worry lines, creased further at the sight of the crowbar and the blood-staining John's sleeve. "John," he began, concern lacing his voice. "What happened?" Before John could explain, Dr. Amelia Chen, a woman with a sharp intellect and a no-nonsense demeanor, bustled past them. Her brow furrowed as she examined John's wound, her movements brisk and efficient. "Minor laceration," she declared, her voice betraying a hint of impatience. "Clean it and bandage it. Now, tell me what happened out there." John recounted the encounter in the grocery store, his voice strained. Relief flickered across Dr. Chen's face when he finished. "Lucky you had Ethan there," she said, her gaze briefly meeting Ethan's. "That was a close call." Ethan seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. John knew the young man was still grieving the loss of his family, ripped apart by the curse soon after it first descended upon Hollow Creek. Reverend Crow, his voice heavy, spoke up. "The darkness comes earlier, each day. It won't be long before the hunt begins." A collective shiver went down John's spine. He remembered the first time he'd witnessed the city's transformation at nightfall. Familiar sounds of a bustling city car horns, children's laughter vanishing into an unsettling stillness. The air thick with anticipation, broken only by the chilling howl that echoed through the empty streets, a signal for the monstrous transformation. Tension grew as evening settled. The weak light filtering through the boarded-up windows dwindled, and the fluorescent street lamps flickered menacingly. John took his position by a reinforced window, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Ethan huddled in a corner, clutching a worn teddy bear. Reverend Crow led a prayer in a hushed voice, its words offering little comfort in the face of the impending terror. Suddenly, a deafening crash ripped through the night. It came from across the street, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Panic surged through the room. The hunt had begun. John slammed the shutter shut, darkness plunging the room into an oppressive silence. He could hear the sounds of scraping claws and guttural growls, chilling closer with each passing moment. Another crash resonated from the hallway, followed by a terrified whimper. John knew their haven wasn't completely secure. They'd seen it happen before the mutated creatures, driven by an insatiable hunger, using brute force to break through barricades. Fear coiled in his gut, the taste of metallic blood lingering on his tongue. He gripped the crowbar, his knuckles white. This was it. The fight for survival. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. The night stretched on, an eternity of terrified silence punctuated by the distant echoes of the hunt. Dawn finally arrived, a pale sliver of light creeping through the cracks in the boarded windows. John, his body a tense coil of muscle, finally allowed himself to relax. Relief washed over him, leaving a bitter aftertaste. They had survived another night, but at what cost? The heavy oak door of the haven creaked open, revealing a scene of devastation. Furniture lay overturned, books ripped apart, and a trail of blood smeared across the hallway floor. John's stomach lurched. One of them was missing. His gaze fell on a discarded teddy bear Ethan's. Panic surged through him, sharp and icy. "Ethan," he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. Silence greeted him. Amelia emerged from her makeshift medical station, her face drawn. "It's Sarah," she said, confirming John's worst fear. There were signs of struggle. They must have taken her during the attack. A suffocating wave of despair threatened to engulf John. He clenched his fists, anger warring with grief. Sarah was a young woman, full of life, a stark contrast to the decaying world they inhabited. Her absence was a gaping hole, a grim reminder of their vulnerability. John scanned the group. Ethan sat in a corner, his face pale and vacant, the teddy bear clutched tightly in his hand. Reverend Crow offered him a comforting hand on the shoulder, but Ethan ignored it, his eyes locked in a 1,000-yard stare. Paranoia and mistrust, like poisonous seeds, had begun to take root within the survivors. John cleared his throat, his voice tight. "We need a plan. We can't stay here forever." Amelia sighed, her brow furrowed. "There's an abandoned train yard on the outskirts. Maybe we can find a locomotive that's still operational." "It's a long shot," but she trailed off, her voice betraying the desperation in her heart. John nodded. "Escape seems like our only option. But how do we get there across the city without becoming another meal?" Ethan, who had been strangely quiet, spoke up for the first time. "There's the library downtown. Maybe we can find some information on the curse, a way to stop it." John considered this. They had stumbled upon scraps of information before, newspaper clippings hinting at a ritual that might hold the key. But the library, a sprawling building in the heart of the city, would be a death trap during the day, let alone nightfall. Reverend Crow, a flicker of hope in his eyes, chimed in. "I have some knowledge of the library's layout. There's a hidden passage that could lead us in undetected." A dangerous plan, but it was their only lead. John looked at Ethan, his eyes pleading. "You up for it, kid?" Ethan held John's gaze for a long moment, then nodded, a flicker of determination replacing the emptiness in his eyes. Maybe, John thought, the search could be a focus, a distraction from the grief that threatened to consume him. The day unfolded in a tense blur. John and Amelia scouted potential escape routes, their conversations laced with the weight of Sarah's disappearance and the ever-present threat of the next hunt. Meanwhile, Ethan and Reverend Crow ventured into the city, their destination The library, a haven of knowledge that now held the potential for both salvation and danger. As dusk approached, cloaking the city in its perpetual twilight, Ethan and Reverend Crow emerged from the library, a dusty book clutched in the Reverend's hands. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, the edges frayed, but the inscription on its front sent a jolt through John Hollow Creek Chronicles, a legacy of darkness. Its yellowed pages might hold the secrets they desperately sought, the key to breaking the everlasting hunger. Chapter 4, Whispers from a Forgotten Past. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, John, Amelia, and Ethan huddled around the dusty journal, its brittle pages whispering secrets of a bygone era. Reverend Crow, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and fascination, translated the faded script. The journal belonged to a local historian named Samuel Davies, penned during the early days of the curse. It spoke of a desperate attempt by the town's leaders to appease a malevolent entity they believed responsible for the nightly transformations. The ritual, a chilling concoction of rare ingredients and ancient incantations, offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to sever the curse's hold on Hollow Creek. John felt a surge of cautious optimism. This was what they'd been searching for, a way to fight back, to reclaim their lives from this twilight nightmare. However, a shadow of doubt flickered across his mind as he observed Reverend Crow. The man's normally steady hands trembled slightly as he traced the symbols on the page. "There's something you're not telling us, isn't there, Reverend?" John's voice was a low growl. The weight of suspicion hung heavy in the air. Reverend Crow met John's gaze, his eyes flickering with a strange emotion John couldn't decipher. "The ritual is dangerous, John. It requires venturing into forbidden parts of the city, places untouched by human presence since the curse began." John scoffed. "We've been facing danger every night, haven't we? This is our chance, maybe our only one." Amelia, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. "The journal mentions specific ingredients. Nightshade, wolfsbane, where do we even find such things?" Reverend Crow cleared his throat. "There's a place, the old city gardens. Legends say they haven't succumbed to the decay, but it lies beyond the wall." John knew exactly what the wall was, a makeshift barrier constructed from debris and the wreckage of abandoned vehicles, separating the safe part of the city from the untamed wilderness beyond. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones, a desolate wasteland teeming with mutated creatures, their hunger even more insatiable under the constant darkness. Fear prickled at John's skin, but the image of Sarah's vacant eyes, the echo of her blood-curdling scream, fueled his resolve. They had to try. The following day, a tense silence hung over the group as they prepared for their perilous journey. John strapped on his makeshift armor, scraps of metal scavenged from abandoned cars, offering meager protection against the razor-sharp claws and teeth of the mutated creatures. Amelia filled a backpack with medical supplies, a grim reminder of the potential cost of their venture. Ethan, his face a mask of stoicism, clutched the journal, its words offering a twisted sense of direction. Reverend Crow led them through a labyrinth of back alleys, the air thick with the stench of decay and the ever-present dread. Finally, they reached the wall, a crumbling testament to a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of order. Fear coiled in John's gut as they clambered over the debris, venturing into the forbidden zone. The old city gardens, once a haven of vibrant blooms and manicured lawns, were now a twisted parody of their former glory. Skeletal trees clawed at the twilight sky, their branches hung with grotesque, fleshy pods that pulsed with an eerie light. Strange, guttural sounds echoed from the depths of the overgrown undergrowth. As John crouched, searching for the nightshade mentioned in the journal. A blood-curdling growl shattered the silence. A monstrous figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with predatory hunger. John's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. Their first taste of the dangers lurking beyond the wall. The chapter ends with a heart-pounding chase scene, John and his companions scrambling to escape the clutches of the mutated creature. The chase highlights the ever-present danger lurking in the forbidden zone, leaving them battered but alive, and the precious nightshade clutched tightly in John's hand. They have found their first ingredient, but the true test and the answer to John's suspicions about Reverend Crow lies ahead. Chapter 5. Fractures in the Twilight. John stumbled out of the overgrown thicket, his lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The monstrous creature, a hulking mass of mutated flesh, had been relentless in its pursuit. He clutched the nightshade, a handful of wilted purple flowers, a meager prize for a near-death experience. Relief washed over him as he saw Amelia and Ethan huddled together, their faces etched with concern. But the moment of reunion was shattered by a chilling accusation. "Why didn't you warn us about those things out there, Reverend?" John rasped, his voice laced with suspicion. "You knew what lurked beyond the wall, didn't you?" Reverend Crow, his face pale, straightened his robes. "John, the journal only hinted at dangers we couldn't have anticipated." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" John cut him off, his frustration boiling over. "There's something you're not telling us." Ethan, who had been unusually quiet since their escape, intervened. "John, maybe the Reverend just didn't know." John's gaze snapped towards him. "This isn't about not knowing, Ethan. It's about trust." Ethan flinched, a flicker of resentment crossing his youthful features. John had noticed a growing distance between him and the teenager lately, a subtle shift in loyalty towards the charismatic Reverend Crow. The stress of the situation, the constant fear, was taking its toll, eroding their fragile sense of unity. Amelia, the ever-pragmatic voice of reason, stepped in. "Enough," she said, her tone firm. "We need to focus. We still have ingredients to gather. Arguing amongst ourselves won't get us anywhere." Her words, laced with a quiet authority, served as a temporary truce. The following days were a blur of nervous activity. They ventured into abandoned factories, their flashlights cutting through the dust and cobwebs, searching for the wolfsbane mentioned in the journal. They navigated crumbling buildings, their senses on high alert, the silence broken only by the creaking floorboards and the pounding of their own hearts. John couldn't shake off his suspicions about Reverend Crow. The man seemed oddly familiar with the city's forgotten corners, his knowledge of hidden passages and abandoned structures far exceeding that of a simple preacher. John found himself scrutinizing every interaction, every word uttered by the Reverend. One evening, while scavenging for a rare gemstone, another crucial ingredient, John stumbled upon a hidden room in a derelict church. The room, untouched by time, held dusty pews and a faded altar. But what truly sent shivers down John's spine was the collection of leather-bound journals stacked on a lectern. He flipped through one, his eyes widening in recognition. The handwriting matched the journal they possessed, Samuel Davies' Chronicles. But unlike their copy, this one was complete, containing entries beyond the attempted ritual. John scanned a specific passage, his blood running cold. It spoke of a hidden cost, a sacrifice required to appease the entity and break the curse, a human sacrifice. John shut the journal with a slam, the weight of the revelation crushing him. Was this what Reverend Crow was hiding? Did he intend to use one of them, perhaps the vulnerable Ethan, to achieve his goals? Doubt gnawed at John. He had to confront the Reverend, but when he returned to their haven, he found the others gone. Only a single note remained, scrawled in Ethan's shaky handwriting. "We're going to finish the ritual. Don't try to stop us." John's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew where they were headed, the forgotten catacombs beneath the city, the location mentioned in the journal for performing the ritual. John was faced with a terrifying choice: trust the man he increasingly suspected, or risk losing his companions, perhaps even Ethan, to the unknown consequences of the ritual. Grabbing his crowbar, the only weapon he could trust, John set off into the twilight, a desperate resolve hardening his features. The fight for survival had become a desperate gamble, the stakes higher than ever before. Chapter 6: Whispers in the Dark. John sprinted through the twilight streets, the weight of the discovered journal burning in his pocket. He had to reach the catacombs before it was too late. The frantic pounding of his heart echoed against the crumbling buildings, a counterpoint to the unsettling silence of the city. He navigated a maze of forgotten alleys, guided by hazy memories from the journal's descriptions. Finally, he stumbled upon a hidden entrance, a gaping maw in the city's underbelly, shrouded in an unnatural darkness. Cold, stale air wafted towards him, carrying a faint, metallic tang. John hesitated, his grip tightening around the crowbar. This was it, the place where hope and madness might converge. With a deep breath, he plunged into the darkness. The catacombs were a labyrinthine network of tunnels, their walls lined with crumbling brick and skeletal remains. An ethereal green glow emanated from phosphorescent fungi clinging to the damp walls, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the uneven floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the dripping of water and the ragged rhythm of John's own breath. He followed a faint light, filtering from a chamber deeper within the catacombs. Pushing open a massive, rusted door, John found himself in a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in the inky blackness. In the center, a makeshift altar had been constructed from broken tombstones. Ethan, Amelia, and Reverend Crow stood around it, their faces a ghastly pale in the flickering candlelight. A potent mix of herbs and incense filled the air, its acrid scent stinging John's nostrils. The atmosphere crackled with a nervous energy, a sense of desperate hope tinged with an undeniable fear. "John," Ethan's voice broke the silence, a mixture of relief and accusation lacing his words. "You shouldn't have come. There's something you're not telling them," John countered, his gaze fixed on Reverend Crow. "The journal mentions—" The Reverend interrupted him, his voice booming through the cavern. "Time is of the essence, John. We must begin the ritual." John opened his mouth to protest, but before he could utter another word, Reverend Crow launched into a guttural incantation. The words, a bizarre mix of Latin and what sounded like an archaic dialect, echoed through the chamber, sending shivers down John's spine. As the ritual progressed, the flickering candlelight grew erratic, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, a sense of unseen eyes watching their every move. John felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a primal fear gnawing at his insides. Halfway through the ritual, the unforeseen complication arose. As Reverend Crow raised the vial, containing the final ingredient, a crimson liquid shimmering with an unnatural light, a deafening crack echoed through the cavern. A section of the ceiling crumbled, sending a shower of debris cascading down. Dust filled the air, momentarily obscuring their vision. When it settled, John's eyes widened in horror. A towering figure stood at the far end of the chamber, its grotesque form illuminated by the dying candles. It was a creature unlike anything John had ever encountered. A monstrous amalgamation of flesh and bone, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. The entity let out a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the catacombs. The ritual was interrupted, the fragile balance shattered. John felt a surge of primal fear, the realization dawning on him in a horrifying instant. They had awakened something far worse than they could have ever imagined. As the creature surged forward, its razor-sharp claws glinting in the dim light, the chapter ends on a cliffhanger. John throws himself in front of Amelia, his crowbar raised in a desperate attempt to defend them. Will they be able to escape the wrath of this newly awakened entity? Did the ritual backfire, unleashing a horror far greater than the curse itself? The answer hangs in the balance, the fate of the survivors shrouded in the darkness of the catacombs. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Silence. John braced himself for the creature's onslaught, his heart hammering against his ribs. But instead of the expected attack, the monstrous entity let out a deafening screech, its eyes widening in what appeared to be shock. Utilizing this unexpected reprieve, John shoved Amelia and Ethan behind him. "Run!" he roared, his voice hoarse. They didn't need telling twice. Amelia scrambled to her feet, grabbing the satchel containing their meager medical supplies. Ethan, his face a mask of terror, darted past John, his gaze flickering between the creature and the exit. John turned back to face the entity, the flickering candlelight glinting off his crude crowbar. But the creature did not attack. Instead, it began to speak, its voice a guttural rasp that reverberated through the chamber. John strained to understand the words, a bizarre mix of growls and clicks that sent shivers down his spine. Was it pleading? John wasn't sure. The entity's form flickered, its monstrous visage shifting for a fleeting moment, revealing a glimpse of a human face contorted in pain. Had the ritual somehow twisted the creature, trapping a human soul within its monstrous form? This revelation sparked a flicker of something akin to pity within John, a feeling quickly extinguished by the harsh realities of their situation. He couldn't afford to be distracted. His gaze darted towards the exit where Ethan had reached the doorway. But instead of escaping, Ethan hesitated, his eyes locking with John's. A cold, dread-filled John. Ethan wasn't leaving. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his hand emerging with a small, gleaming object. It was the Reverend's silver locket, the one John had seen him clutching on numerous occasions. "You lied to us all," Ethan spat, his voice laced with a newfound venom. "You knew what the ritual would do. You wanted to unleash this thing." John's mind reeled. Betrayal, so sharp and sudden, felt worse than any physical blow. The Reverend, the man they had placed their trust in, had been manipulating them all along. But why? The creature, seemingly sensing the shift in dynamic, let out a deafening roar, snapping John out of his stunned silence. He turned back, his crowbar raised in a defensive stance. This wasn't the time for answers, not yet. "Ethan, get out of here," John bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. But Ethan stood his ground, the silver locket clutched tightly in his hand. "No," he said, a strange defiance hardening his features. "I'm going to finish what the Reverend started." John's breath hitched. Ethan, fueled by grief and a misguided sense of purpose, intended to appease the creature. John lunged forward, grabbing Ethan's arm before he could take another step. "Are you crazy?" John roared. "Don't you see what it is?" Ethan struggled against John's grip, his eyes blazing with a fanatic glint. "It's the only way to break the curse. The Reverend said so." A brutal fight ensued, a desperate struggle between two survivors driven to their breaking points. John, fueled by anger and a desperate need to protect Ethan, overpowered the teenager, shoving him back from the creature. But the distraction came at a cost. The creature, its patience seemingly exhausted, surged forward, its razor-sharp claws aimed at John. John barely had time to raise his crowbar in a desperate block before the creature slammed into him, sending them both crashing into a pile of debris. Pain flared through John's body, a searing agony that stole his breath. Dimly, he saw Amelia rushing towards him, her face etched with a desperate concern. But before she could reach them, the creature loomed over them, its grotesque face mere inches away. Just then, a deafening clang echoed through the chamber. John squinted through the haze of pain, seeing a silver blur flash before his eyes. The creature shrieked in agony, clutching its head as the silver locket flung by Ethan embedded itself in its flesh. The unexpected intervention created a momentary opening. With a surge of adrenaline, John shoved the creature back, scrambling to his feet. Amelia was at his side, her voice a tight whisper. "We need to get out of here, now." John agreed, his vision blurring at the edges. He grabbed Amelia's hand, and together they stumbled towards the exit, Ethan hot on their heels. Behind them, the creature let out a blood-curdling roar, the sound echoing through the catacombs as they fled into the darkness. Chapter 8. The Unseen Horizon. They reached the exit, bursting out of the catacombs into the cool night air. The silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged gasps for breath. John stumbled, his vision blurry from pain and adrenaline. He looked back at the entrance, half expecting the monstrous entity to emerge, but the opening remained ominously dark. Why? Why did it stop? Amelia rasped, her voice trembling. John had no answer. The silver locket, Ethan's misguided offering, had caused the creature momentary pain, but its true effect remained a mystery. A cold dread gnawed at John's gut. Perhaps a temporary retreat, but for how long? "We can't stay here," John croaked, pushing himself upright. His body throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder of the creature's attack. He glanced at Ethan, who stood a few paces away, his face pale and drawn. The locket lay discarded at his feet, a silent testament to his betrayal. "Ethan," John began, his voice laced with a weary anger, "you almost got us all killed." Ethan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the locket. Shame and defiance warred within his eyes. "There's no point in arguing now," Amelia interjected, her voice firm. "We need to find somewhere safe to rest and tend to John's wounds." They moved with a desperate urgency, their footsteps echoing through the deserted streets. The city, once shrouded in an oppressive twilight, now seemed eerily silent. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they reached a familiar building, a boarded-up grocery store they had scavenged before, a horrifying realization dawned on John. The silence wasn't a sign of respite. It was a terrifying absence. Where were the usual sounds of the mutated creatures? The growls, the scrapes, the blood-curdling screams. Suddenly, a guttural roar shattered the silence, closer this time. John spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw them, dozens of figures, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. But these weren't the monstrous creatures they'd encountered before. These were their former companions, their neighbors, their friends, all transformed, their humanity replaced by a grotesque hunger. Reverend Crow, his face contorted in a feral snarl, led the charge. The silver locket, now embedded in his chest, pulsed with an unnatural light. John's blood ran cold. The ritual hadn't broken the curse. It had twisted it. Now, everyone in Hollow Creek was infected, forever trapped in a cycle of the everlasting hunger. A desperate battle ensued. John, fueled by a primal urge to survive, fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Ethan, seemingly consumed by guilt, stood frozen for a moment before joining the fight with a vengeance. Amelia, ever the pragmatist, assessed their limited options. "We need to get out of here," she yelled, brandishing a makeshift weapon fashioned from a metal pipe. "There's an old fire escape on the roof of the building next door. It might lead us out of the city." Hope, a fragile flicker amidst the despair, ignited in John's chest. He fought his way towards Amelia, shoving back the transformed figures with a ferocity born of desperation. Reaching her, he grabbed her hand, and together they sprinted towards the adjoining building. Ethan, his face streaked with tears and grime, held off the encroaching horde, his movements fueled by a desperate need to redeem himself. John glanced back once, a pang of guilt twisting his gut as he saw Ethan disappear under the weight of the transformed figures. They scrambled onto the rickety fire escape, its rusted metal groaning under their weight. Below, the transformed creatures snarled and tore at each other, driven by their insatiable hunger. As they reached the roof, John looked out at the vast expanse of the city, bathed in a perpetual twilight. The once familiar buildings now loomed like skeletal giants, a chilling testament to the curse's hold. "There," Amelia gasped, pointing towards a distant horizon. A faint sliver of light, barely perceptible, peeked through the thick layer of clouds above the city walls. It was dawn, but for Hollow Creek, it would never come. John knew their escape was a gamble, a desperate hope against a seemingly insurmountable darkness. But as they climbed down the rickety fire escape on the other side of the building, disappearing into the unknown wilderness beyond the city walls, a sliver of hope remained. The everlasting hunger might have consumed Hollow,